In every console generation, there are always winners and losers. It's just the natural process of things. Sometimes you lose because of bad luck, sometimes because of bad timing, while other times there are factors that are totally beyond your control. However, every now and then you come across a series of business decisions that are so baffling, so befuddling, and so completely bonkers that even Peter Plonker himself wouldn't put his name to them. So this episode, we take a look at these stumbled systems, these hardware howlers, and these firmware faux pas, as I say. But, hello you, I'm Guru Larry, and I welcome you to Fact Hunt, Top 5 Botched Console Launches. Atari's 2600 video computer system was the console that started it all, kicking off a multi-million-dollar industry and making Nolan Bushnell's company a household name. However, Atari's attempt at making a follow-up proved disastrous at best. The original successor, the 5200 Super System, which was based on Atari's existing 8-bit computer hardware, had failed to catch on with gamers, partially thanks to its awful non-centering analog sticks and backwards incompatibility. Is that a word? But mainly due to them dragging their heels and releasing the thing slap bang in the middle of the North American video game crash. But with parent company Warner Communications losing faith as Atari to turn things around, they looked towards an outside company to come up with the goods. Step forward General Computer Corporation, a group of young engineers who had shot to prominence after releasing a series of illegal modification boards for arcade games such as Pac-Man and Missile Command. Their work on the latter game ended up getting them sued by Warner Brothers, but rather than closing down GCC, they actually invited the modders to come and work for them. After creating new arcade games for Atari, such as Food Fight and Quantum, GCC was set to work on a new successor for the Atari 2600. The result was the 7800 Pro system, as 2600 plus 5200 makes 7800. Bet you didn't notice that before. This new console will not only play a range of advanced new super games, but it would also let you play your existing 2600 games too. When the 7800 was finally unveiled, the reaction from the press was beyond positive, with many claiming that this was the console that was going to save the North American video game market. In June of 1984, it was launched in the local test market of California to great fanfare, with the vast majority of critics preferring Atari's new console over the rival Nintendo Entertainment System, which was also going through test markets at the same time. And it wasn't just the press that preferred it either. The 7800 sold out across the state, and focus groups with local gamers produced a very clear winner. So, if it's doing so well, what went wrong? Well, in July 1984, Warner Communications decided to give up on Atari and sold the loss-making consumer division to Jack Tramiel and his company, Tramiel Technology, who would in turn rename themselves as Atari Corporation. Now obviously, Jack was keen to get the 7800 right back out there for a full-scale, worldwide release. The problem, however, was that GCC had never been paid for their work, and what followed was 2 years of legal disputes over who actually owned the 7800, who should be paying GCC, and just how much it was actually worth. In the end, tight-fisted Jack coughed up the cash. Not wanting to wait any longer after seeing Nintendo's system take off in a big way, and another rival system from Sega in the form of the Master System arrive and dominate their European market too. Sadly, that 2-year delay severely cost Atari. It gave Nintendo a clear run to capture the market in North America, and despite sales of over 5 million worldwide, the Atari 5800 finished in a very distant second place in its home market. Surprisingly, the 7800 actually outsold the Master System 2-1 in North America, but that's a very small consolation when you actually consider what could have been for the poor system. Our next entry is the system that got the world twatting their relatives round the back of the head with controllers and smashing their lovely new LCD televisions. The Nintendo Wii.
Oh. Mama! Oh gosh! Mama!
After the relative failure of the GameCube, Nintendo needed to come up with something radically different. And the Wii was most certainly it. Although the actual hardware inside was barely an upgrade on the Cube, the way you used the console couldn't have been more different. The arrival of motion controls and the innovative Wiimote saw Nintendo garner a whole new audience away from the stereotypical gamer. Everyone wanted a Wii, from your kids to your granny, to everyone in France every time they said yes. This was the must-you-have item for your living room. Launched in North America on the 19th of November 2006, the European launch was penciled in for just a month later, making sure it was out in time for that lucrative Christmas slot. However, as fine and dandy as this sounds, there was one tiny little flaw in Nintendo's plan. You can't really launch a console if you don't have any stock. Nintendo either grossly underestimated how many people would want a Wii, or are just plain incompetent in getting them out to stores, because no one could actually buy one. Those that did were quickly scalping them on eBay up to 4 times the price, and people were more than happy to pay that too. Luckily for Nintendo, these stock shortages didn't end up doing them any long-term harm, as the Wii would go on to dominate its generation, remaining top of everyone's most wanted list going into the following year. Well, when it came to sales of the console anyway, possibly down to non-gamers happy to just play the free copy of Wii Sports they got with it, or the sheer amount of shovelware it spawned, sales were less than impressive. I mean, when the company that made Ninja Bread Man is your most successful third-party publisher, you might want to reflect on your quality control. But it cannot be argued that the Wii very much put Nintendo right back into the spotlight. Of course, there are people who will point out Nintendo's record of creating stock shortages themselves to build up hype and hysteria around these products. I mean, Amiibos and NES Minis, anyone? But I wouldn't be so daring or controversial to suggest such a thing, would I? Quite a surprising entry this time, as the House of Sonic's Angular Box of Joy takes next place on our list. Even more surprising, it's about the European launch of the Master System to be exact. But I know what you're saying. Wasn't the Master System huge in Euroland, Larry? And well, yes it was. But that didn't stop Sega from making a complete pig's ear out of it. Cast your minds back to 1986, and Sega has just signed a deal with several leading European distributors to launch the console on their behalf, including Master Games in France, Areola Soft in Germany, and everyone's favourite budget game peddlers, Mastertronic, in the UK. A huge advertising campaign was run to make the Master System the most must-have games machine that Christmas. But due to some major incompetence by Sega, they failed to actually hand over any inventory at all to their European distributors until Boxing Day, the day after Christmas Day. This resulted in not just revival of angry parents who couldn't purchase the top item on Little Timmy's Christmas list, but also wide-scale backlash from retailers demanding compensation. In fact, Sega's ineptitude was so catastrophic, it ended up putting both Master Games and Mastertronic into liquidation due to all the lost sales. Thankfully, eccentric balloon-fancying billionaire beady man Richard Branson stepped forward to save both Master Games and Mastertronic, merging them into his existing company, Virgin Games. Virgin. From here, the Master System went from strength to strength, and soon became the industry leader in Europe. In fact, Sega was so impressed by the way Virgin Games marketed the console in Europe, they actually ended up buying the whole company. Sega totally dodged a bullet with this one. However, that luck was not to last. history has taught us, it's not uncommon for a manufacturer to botch up a console's launch so much that it ultimately destroys the entire company. And there's no example finer than this than Atari with the Jaguar. Now beforehand, Atari were pretty slow to react to the arrival of the 16-bit consoles back at the end of the 80s and early 90s. But in 1990, they announced they were going to release an all-new 32-bit console called the Panther the following year, claiming this new hardware would wipe the floor with both the Mega Drive and the Super Nintendo. Not long after this announcement, Atari also revealed that another console would follow it a couple of years later, based on 64-bit technology. But it soon became apparent that the development of the Jaguar, which was being designed in the UK by ex-Sinclair research bods Flare Technology, was progressing at a faster rate. So the release of the Panther was promptly cancelled just as development kits were arriving with software houses. However, issues with the Jaguar began to arise when Flare were hitting snags with designing and debugging the system's custom chipset. This meant that several compromises had to be made with the design to get it ready for manufacture, delaying the console beyond the hoped 1992 release date and well into 1993. Come the end of that year, and cash-strapped Atari couldn't wait any longer. They had to get the Jaguar to market and forego the rest of the much-needed bug fixes. But the next problem was that Atari could no longer manufacture them, having sold all their existing plants in Hong Kong and Taiwan to raise enough cash to keep the company afloat. So they turned to creators IBM PC for help. They seemed like a perfect fit. They were American, so Atari could pull the patriotic angle, despite it technically being British. They knew how to build computers and had a rich manufacturing history. The problem was, however, that IBM had never built a games console before, let alone one with advanced custom processors and non-standard parts. IBM's disastrous handling of the Jaguar production ended up costing Atari dearly. The planned European launch of the Jaguar in 1993 had to be almost completely cancelled. Despite Atari's Euro division raking up pre-orders of 2.5 million units, just 2,000 consoles could be produced for an event at Hamley's historic toy store in London. Jaguars sold out almost immediately in both the New York and Californian test markets in America, but then, nothing. Atari had no more stock and didn't know when more was coming. IBM were in meltdown, distributors were losing faith, and consumers were starting to look ahead to the recently announced Sega Saturn and Sony PlayStation. By the time production finally caught up with Atari's requirements in the summer of 1994, it was all too late. Nobody wanted a Jaguar anymore. It was old news, and Atari had pretty much destroyed any good faith in the gaming industry they had left. Dismal sales of just 225,000 units caused Atari to exit the console market just 2 years later, leaving them wondering just what could have been had they been able to get this system out back in 1992. And where else could we put the most famous incident on our list? As not only did it cripple such a well-loved company, but also inadvertently destroyed a successive console too. While many of the previous entries were victims of bad luck, outside factors beyond the company's control and unavoidable obstacles, this last entry comes down to nothing other than sheer and utter incompetence and wholesale arrogance that backfired on a nuclear scale. With the much hyped and technologically more advanced Sony PlayStation waiting in the wings, Sega knew they had to pull something very special out of the hat if they were to take the early advantage in the 32-bit console war. So, in a shock announcement in March 1995, Sega of America CEO Tom Kalinske announced that the Saturn would be released in the US on Saturn Day, Saturday, September the 2nd, 1995. However, Sega of Japan didn't really like this date, demanded that the launch be pushed 4 months ahead to give the Saturn the early advantage it would need over the PlayStation. So, during the first ever E3 on May the 11th, 1995, Kalinske gave a keynote presentation in which he revealed the release price of $399 and describing the features of the console. Kalinske also revealed that, due to high consumer demand, Sega had already shipped 30,000 Saturns to Toys R Us, Babbage's, Electronics Boutique, and software etc. for immediate release. This announcement, however, completely backfired, upsetting retailers who were not informed of the surprise release but were also excluded from the initial allocation of stock. This included major chains such as Best Buy, Walmart and KB Toys, who responded by dumping Sega altogether from their lineup. And if that wasn't bad enough, Sony subsequently unveiled their retail price for the PlayStation. Sony Computer Entertainment America president Steve Race took to the stage, simply said $299 and then walked away to rapturous applause. The Saturn's release in Europe, where Sega led the market thanks to the huge success the Master System and the Mega Drive had before it, also came early and before the previously announced North American date too. It would arrive in stores on July the 8th, 1995 at a price of £399. This also totally backfired. European retailers, the press, and even Sega Europe themselves did not have any time to promote the system nor its games, severely harming sales. It also didn't help that the launch lineup consisted of games that had quite clearly been rushed to release and paled in comparison to the flashy visuals of their PlayStation counterparts. So, despite all the early promises and predictions that Sega would once again rule the roost, the Saturn ended up being vastly outsold by both the PlayStation and eventually the Nintendo 64, so was discontinued just 3 years after its release in 1998. Leaving Sega licking its wounds, having been taught some very valuable lessons in the process, which ultimately they never recovered from. The Saturn stigma even outshadowed the launch of Sega's next console, the Dreamcast, amongst other issues. But that, my friends, is a story for another day. Hello you, thanks ever so much for watching. Be sure to subscribe to be first to see future Fact Hunt episodes. Click on the bell if you already are to make sure you're notified, and be sure to check out my other episodes. And if you want to be super awesome, check out my Patreon. But thanks again for watching, and I'll be seeing you next time. Ta-ra for now.